This speaker represents the cutting edge of current speaker building technology and utilizes digital signal processing to achieve superb performance. Totally. But it also represents a look back at some of the most righteous speakers of the past by reimagining a radical design from my era, the 1980s, a time that I consider to be the most bodacious period of loudspeaker design ever. Word. Thanks for stopping by. We're Thomas, and this is Zargo Audio Projects. So in order to explain why we needed to build this gnarly system in the first place, I've got to take you back. The time was the mid-1980s, and let me introduce you to a lanky teenager who was really starting to get into home hi-fi audio. Yep, I could dunk a basketball back then. I could also ride a moped, I guess. I had a 67 Mustang and a 74 Duster. I kind of wish I could have that one back. But if you look close, you can see in these very 1980s looking photos, thanks a lot Miami Vice, the Radio Shack 12-inch three-way speakers that I was so proud of, here and here. As a teen, I'd often hit the Radio Shack store to check out the latest speaker systems available in genuine oiled walnut veneer. Yep, back in the 1980s, they sold legit stereo equipment at the mall, at both the Shack, as well as a store called Wall to Wall Sound and Video. Wall to Wall had lots of speaker systems to peruse back then. Most of them looked more or less normal, but there was one manufacturer who took a different approach, Design Acoustics. At that time, they sold a line of speakers called Point Source, one of which had a woofer facing down on the bottom of the cabinet, along with a mid-range and tweeter in a traditional position facing front. It was a pretty compact design, and once I heard it, I wanted it. It's not that it was perfect necessarily, but boy was it unique. It had a punch to the sound, and the look. I just thought they were one of the coolest looking speakers I'd ever seen. But back in the 1980s, neither one of us could afford a pair of those things. But I never did forget about them, and I've always wanted to try and recreate them somehow. Enter Toid's DIY Audio YouTube channel.
Hey, it's 123 Toid. I'm with Tom Zarbo.
I know Mr. Toid because he interviewed me several years back at Parts Express's speaker design competition, and ever since then I've been a big fan of his channel. So when I started up my channel and Nick mentioned he'd be open to doing a collaboration, this seemed like a perfect fit. Our plan was we'd work out the enclosure volume and basic design together. I'd build 2 pairs of enclosures and ship 1 pair to Senor Toid, and he'd work out the passive crossover and DSP settings. The design may look fairly simple from the outside, but inside it's actually pretty snug in there, and the driver we picked for the bass duties necessitated a beefy and well-braced cabinet. From the sketches and dimensions I worked up, I decided to create a full-size drawing to better visualize where everything needs to go. This is a 3-way speaker system, and it's, like I said, snug. The bottom of the cabinet houses a GRS 8-inch subwoofer, which radiates sound out of the slot between the base and the main cabinet, just as the original Point Source speakers did back in the 1980s. After I got things laid out to where it looked like everything would fit, I created a cardboard mock-up, just to be sure there was clearance between all the internal bits. Once I was sure there were no interference issues, it was time to head to the table saw. I mitered the corners on the cabinets that I constructed for Senor Toid and myself. I wanted to use miter joints to eliminate any visible end grain, which always seems to show up as a raised portion through the veneer after a year or so. Miter joints easily eliminate that issue. They are a little trickier to cut and build though, so if you'd like to duplicate this design, feel free to use butt joints if you'd like to keep things simple. Now, the cabinet may look like a simple cube, and you guys know how much I like cubes, but it's actually 12 inches wide and tall and 13 inches deep. Nick and I went back and forth a few times on the final dimensions because Nick was like, "Hey Tom, the cabinet's kind of big, don't you think?" And I was all like, "Nick, I think we should go deeper. We won't be able to get enough bass out of it." And Nick was all like, "Zarbo, we're using DSP, remember? Trust the process, Ing." So yeah, Nick was right. The smaller cabinet works just fine. After I test fit all the panels, I used Gorilla Glue and a combination of blue painter's tape and strap clamps to secure the cabinets while the glue dried. The Gorilla Glue expands as it cures, and that foamy stuff needs to be scraped off the cabinet. Then the whole thing gets a nice block sanding. Next, I needed to measure, then cut the pieces of walnut veneer for my set and oak veneer for Mr. Toid's pair. I did go to the trouble to match the grain top to front on both pairs. These speakers will have grilles though, so the necessity of doing that is debatable, but it doesn't cost any extra, so why not, right? Since the enclosure size is not a perfect cube, it's 12 by 12 by 13 inches, remember, I made sure to mark up each piece of veneer so I don't glue, say, a side piece to the back, for instance, and not have enough to cover the side. I did recess every driver, but the tweeter and midwoofer have very shallow recesses, so I'll do them after the veneer is applied. The woofer recess, however, can be done while the cabinet is still in the raw, and I'll show you how I deal with trimming the veneer for that driver in just a bit. I'm using my favorite process of applying veneer here, the iron-on method. I think I veneered in this order: front and back, then the sides, then the top and bottom. This took me several days to do, and remember, there were 4 cabinets in total, and 4 bases as well, all of which got veneer. So after a while, I just felt like I was getting a bit overwhelmed and I just needed a break. I was too tired to schlep myself up the stairs, so... By now you've realized I like Star Trek. Yeah, I know, it's science fiction. I didn't beam out. I just left through the door. It was a lot of veneering though, so let me show you how I ended up trimming off some of the excess veneer from the cabinets. This is a tool I made several years ago. I always wanted to make this. It uses a circular razor, the kind that rotary craft cutters use. I bought a 20 pack of the blades and made this little hand trimmer up. The razor stays put and sort of gets clamped in by the holder. I did use some super glue to help hold it, but once I got it dialed in, it worked exceptionally well. It easily cuts the veneer flush to the cabinet, so very little sanding is necessary. I did use a backer board to prevent the upward pressure from the blade from lifting up the veneer. In fact, after rough trimming a few pieces of veneer with a router and flush cut bit, and not liking how it was coming out, see all those fuzzies? I just ended up rough trimming with a razor, and then I do the final trim with my rotary veneer trimmer. That actually worked out really well. As you saw, the bases have veneer along their thickness on the front, back, and sides, as well as on the top. I veneered the little back strip first, fairly easy, and easy to trim thanks to my nifty trimming tool. Notice the curve on the front 2 corners of the base, which matches the roundover on the grills. I wanted to veneer the front and both sides of the base in one process, so I tested a strip of veneer on the curve to make sure it would conform to the curve without cracking. It didn't crack, but I did feel quite a bit of resistance, and we all know resistance is futile. So here's a veneering tip for you. If you have a piece of veneer that needs to bend around a curve, but you're feeling more resistance than you'd like, spray some veneer tamer on it and let it sit for a day or so. I laid out the 4 long strips of veneer on some paper towels and then proceeded to spray them on the wrong side. Yeah, I sprayed the back. You're supposed to spray the wood side. So I wiped them down, flipped them over, and then sprayed the correct wood side. Then covered them up with another piece of paper towel and put some weight on them to keep them from getting wavy. By the next day, they were soft and supple and ready to conform to that 1-inch radius curve, no problem. Apply glue and wait 30 minutes. Then iron on with medium-high heat. Wait a day, then trim. After I veneered the tops of the bases, I was all done with the veneer work. Now that the veneering's done, let me double back like I promised and show you how I made the recess for the bottom mounted subdriver, as well as how I created the grills and inset the magnets that hold them prior to veneering. With this little test fit up, you can really start to see how snug it's going to be inside the cabinet. I didn't do a full recess with this driver as it has a thick mounting flange, but I did want to set it in somewhat. So I settled on a 1/4 inch recess and I made 2 passes with the circle jig. Then I just cut the driver opening with a jigsaw. Fun fact about me, I really dislike doing driver recesses and cutouts. Not sure why, probably stems from my childhood, but at any rate, I just don't like doing them. So any shortcut I can take here is a good deal in my opinion, as long as the end result is basically the same. Check out this circular strip of MDF left over. You think that's a problem? Nope, it is not. Remember, big box MDF is basically glorified cardboard, so it's not hard to remove. I never cease to be amazed at just how little effort it takes to remove this strip of MDF. I could easily snap it off with my fingers, but the chisel does a much neater job. The original point source speakers had a rounded grille that matched the curve of the base, and I wanted to do the same thing, just with a bit more radius. I ripped down some high quality 2x4 lumber to 1 1/4 inch square until I had enough pieces to make all 4 grills. I find that it's easier to rip small pieces than large ones, as any twist in the boards won't tend to bind up the blade as much. I mitered the ends to the proper size and even made little gusset pieces from scrap triangle cutoffs. Then after a dry fit to make sure everything was good, I glued them up, rounded them over, and created a recess in the rear to accommodate the grill cloth as it wrapped around the frame. I made a few passes on the table saw to create that recess, but it does a perfect job of hiding the cloth once you go to apply it. Then I created a template board to locate and drill the magnet holes accurately. This means each grill and cabinet would be exactly the same, so they would all fit perfectly. I did a test with just 4 3/8 inch magnets that I've used before, and to me it didn't feel like it would hold well enough. So I went ahead and purchased more Neo magnets from Harbor Freight Tools, thinking they were the same size, but they were not. They were smaller. They've reduced the size of their Neo magnets. Anyway, I went ahead and drilled the holes for all the magnets, and when I went to epoxy in the larger outer magnets, I came into a problem. They wouldn't stay in. I've done this many times before and never had an issue, but this time they just wouldn't push into the hole. Well, they went in, but then pushed right back out again. I knew what was happening, but it was almost too late, as this was 5-minute epoxy I was working with. So thinking fast, I quickly loaded up my drill with a small drill bit and made a relief hole next to each of the outer magnet holes on an angle so the excess epoxy could squirt out. This was almost too little too late, as the epoxy was beginning to set. I did manage to get all the magnets pushed under the surface, although some needed a little persuading. That's not good for magnets, by the way. Doing that can reduce their magnetic strength, but at least they were all in. The other issue I had was that the Harbor Freight magnets were so thin that it was difficult to get them inserted perpendicular to the baffle. They were just too small and fiddly to work with. So the end result of all of this was less than perfect. I had to grind down some of the magnets on the cabinets a bit so I could put Bondo on them to have a smooth surface to veneer to, and that resulting heat caused a few of the magnets to lose strength. They all did hold, technically, but not with enough strength to satisfy me. So it was time for Plan B. Or Plan C, depending on how you're keeping score. I ordered some larger barrel magnets online from TotalElement, link below. They were 3/8 inch by 3/8 inch thick and were stronger than most others. So I repeated the process and installed them basically the same way, just in the middle, top and bottom. Well, these magnets are super powerful.
Oh, that holds good.
And just 2 of these per cabinet would have held the grills in place easily. They weren't cheap, but it kind of was the right tool for the job, so it was worth it in the end.
Oof.
So let's learn. What did I do wrong here? What were my mistakes? First, I just epoxied too many holes at one time. Doing, say, 4 at a time instead of all 16 would have made life much easier once I discovered I had an issue. Second, it's possible that I did not get a true 50-50 mix of resin and hardener, causing it to set up too fast. At any rate, using larger, more powerful magnets worked much better for installation as well as use, so that's my recommendation. Next, I shot some black paint on the grill frames. Then I cut out some appropriate sized pieces of black grill cloth. I cranked up my hot glue gun and glued the cloth to the frames right where I machined out that notch on the table saw earlier. I'll set a link to a video I created on making grills if you'd like more details on all of this. That covers everything. Truth is though, this is fairly easy, so don't be intimidated. Yeah, they look nice on the front, but the back looks a little too DIY, if you know what I mean. We need some very carefully cut out pieces of black flannel, a little spray adhesive, and done. Man, that's pretty. Good idea, big guy. Next up, creating the recesses and through holes for the tweeter and midwoofer. I double check with my drawing to make sure I'm drilling in exactly the correct spot. First, I use a Forstner bit to make the recess, and then the through hole for the tweeter. I used my circle jig to create the recess for the midwoofer, and I used a jigsaw to create the opening as well as a notch for the terminals. I also had to reduce some of the material on back so the driver can breathe better. I did that with a Dremel. Yep, fits good. I created the openings for the vents with the same techniques. I ever so slightly undersized my recess cut, so I had to sand it a touch to get it to fit. Per our design, I had to cut 1 inch off the length of the vent, which I did at the miter saw. I made a prototype of the midwoofer enclosure before I even began cabinet construction, just to be sure it would work. Generally speaking, 1/4 inch material would be considered too thin, but because of the way it's designed, including those strategically placed braces and use of the main cabinet for 2 of its walls, it works just fine. It only takes a few minutes to cut out the panels. I used MDF for this, 1/4 inch like I mentioned. I wouldn't use plywood personally unless you can find some really good stuff, but most of the 1/4 inch ply is just a bit too thin and I'm afraid it might resonate a touch, even with the bracing. Besides, why not have an all cardboard enclosure, right? Just kidding, this thing's actually as solid as they come. It's not hard to put together. I just put a piece of wax paper down so I don't glue it to the table and a few strategically placed clamps, and it's done. I waited until the midwoofer openings were created before gluing in its sub-enclosure on purpose. This way you can just look in from the driver opening and center it top to bottom by sight and feel. A few clamps and that there thing is now one with the board. I mean the enclosure. That 8-inch GRS subwoofer looks like it wants to hurt someone, or at least jiggle a bunch of stuff. I want to tie the largest panels together to try and reduce cabinet resonances. I settled on this brace shape for basically one reason. It's the only shape that will reach the top and sides without physically interfering with the vent or the sub. Did I mention it was snug in there? Yeah, let's get these installed. I note in the drawings that they are to be cut a smidge too wide. That's so that they can be sanded a bit on each side wing until they fit snugly against the sides of the enclosure. You don't want them so tight that they cause the sides to bow out, but they want just a little friction to create tension in the board. A touch of Gorilla Glue secures them in place. The main cabinet is set off the base by 4 black cylinders. To make these, I cut out equal lengths of 1/2 inch inner diameter PVC pipe and then machined them on my stationary belt sander. Not sure what to call it, but doing this gives them a nice deep textured look. Spray on some black paint, followed by a little clear, and they're ready to go. The final thing I need to make is some type of crossover board mount. Now we can't be sure exactly what electronic doodads will need parts-wise at this point, but I do want to have enough real estate for traditional components for a 2-way speaker. You know, a couple of coils, 2 caps, and a resistor or 2. I've used this setup before. You've got a block with a notch cut out on one side that the crossover board just slides into, and a thin piece of wood to allow it to screw down to hold it into place. The space between the board and the cabinet allows room for soldering connections underneath if need be. While I apply the finish to these enclosures, I'll tie up a few loose ends that I neglected to show you, such as creating the recesses for the cabinet risers to sit in, and drilling out the screw holes for the vent and drivers, painting the bottom of the base as well as the driver recess areas with black paint, drilling a hole for, then hot gluing in the wires for the midwoofer through the sub-enclosure. I used General Finish's dead flat water-based polyurethane sealant for the white oak veneer that seemed to add the least amount of color to the oak and looked basically like untreated wood. In other words, it doesn't dry to a yellowy finish where most normal oil-based polys would. For the walnut, I started with a few coats of Minwax rub-on poly, switched to General Finish's wipe-on poly, then ended with a few more thin coats of the Minwax for that super smooth finish. While I did install drivers in my pair of enclosures, Nick has his own drivers at Casa del Toid, thanks to Parts Express. And while I'm mentioning it, I want to give a huge thank you to Parts Express for supplying both Nick and I with all the drivers, DSP, amp board, power supply, pretty much everything I didn't build out of wood to make both his and my speakers possible. So thanks, Parts Express. This build wouldn't have happened were it not for your generosity. All that's left to do now is to send them off. Actually, that's not so easy. I didn't have any boxes big enough to put these things into, so I had to DIY those as well. Thank goodness for leftover Parts Express boxes, huh? From one Italian craftsman to Signor Toid's laboratory of DSP via UPS, Godspeed, Pint-Sized Powerhouses. Godspeed. Well, my contribution to this collaboration is now complete. If you made it this far, thanks for hanging in there. It's up to you now, Mr. Toid. Make these babies sing. I'll have a link below to Toid's video of part 2 of this speaker build, so check that out. And if you like this video, well, you know what to do. I'd appreciate it. Well, that's it for today. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye now. Hey, dude, you got a wave. Huh? You got a wave. That's how I end these videos. With a wave? That's original. What's wrong with a wave? It simply means goodbye. No, it's fine. It's probably just the whole time travel thing, you know? I've got DeLorean lag, I guess. So, when do we wave again? How about on the count of 3, okay? 1, 2... Wait. Hold on. Do we wave on 3? Like, 1, 2, 3? Or do we go 1, 2, 3, then wave? Because, you know, you really didn't make it clear. Oh, for crying out loud. I'm going right to the wormhole. Wormhole? Whoa, wait, what wormhole?